Welcome to Comic Books and Graphic Novels. We are starting an adventure. Over the course of this adventure, I will take you through the form, content, and history of comic books in America. In each one of my lectures, I will begin, as I ask you to begin every one of your essays, with a thesis statement. These theses will build towards a weekly thesis statement. So my first lecture of the week will present both my thesis statement for that lecture and my thesis statement for the week. This first week of lectures will be somewhat different in that I want to emphasize 3 rules I've developed over the course of my teaching career. These 3 rules are easy ways of thinking about analysis, synthesis, and writing. Over the course of any adventure, however, we should expect to grow and to change, and I see that in 3 main ways. First, I should think that in a very pragmatic way, going through the history of comics will teach us about analysis. It will teach us to break down the text in front of us and to come to a more clear and deeper understanding of how that text works. It will also teach us about the literary arts. Treating comics as literature will expand our sense of comics, but just so, it will also expand our sense of literature, changing the way we think of the individual page and the way pages work together to tell a large-scale story. Finally, any adventure will change the adventurer, and the contemplation of comics is also the contemplation of ourselves. And so, I expect that in giving these lectures, I too will change. Just as in listening to them, I hope you, in some deep and meaningful way, will change as well. So I want to turn to my first rule. Circle the details. And in circling the details, I mean to present in a simplistic way the bedrock of analysis. For analysis is nothing more than breaking down a problem into component parts in which you can study each component part and understand how it contributes to the whole. Circling the details is an easy way of understanding how to approach a text. So to begin with our first text, what better place to start than with Spider-Man? And I have here a page from Ultimate Spider-Man, number 78, an issue written by Brian Michael Bendis and drawn by Mark Bagley and entitled Dumped. Ultimate Spider-Man came out in the year 2000, over a decade ago now, and it was a relaunch of the Spider-Man brand, an attempt to bring in new readers to Spider-Man overall, because the story of Spider-Man, which started in the early 60s, had become so weighty and freighted with detail that Marvel Comics felt it needed a fresh start. So this is a good issue. It's an issue I enjoy reading. And in it, Peter Parker has made the hard decision that he needs to break up with his girlfriend, the adorable Mary Jane Watson. Mary Jane is heartbroken, but what can she do? And after some soul-searching, her friend Liz convinces her to go to a rock concert. The rock concert features a senior, Mark Raxton, on guitar. Mark plays in a punk rock band. Their title song is Molten Man, and the same name is on the drummer's drum set, so we can assume that's the name of the band. Mark's pretty charming. He has a little sense of feminism going on, and he's a senior, and dating seniors is always pretty interesting from the perspective of the lower class woman. The date ends up, like many dates end up, in Mark's economy car in front of a suburban household, with Mark and MJ talking. Let me read to you a bit here. I really meant it. You're really good.
Not yet.
Well, I liked it. And don't let the fact that I haven't left the house in 2 months and that I'm just happy to be out take anything away from the compliment.
I will not.
So, the thing is, do you know who Will Eisner was? You ever hear that name? No. He was like this famous comic book artist. In fact, the guy invented the comic book, the graphic novel. And what he did was he took something away, the writing, an artwork, a comic strip, and he made it into a book. He put it together and he told a story with it. No one thought to do it before him. He was the first. He created something that prior to his creating it, it didn't exist. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. In my music, I want to do that. I want to be that. I want to figure out something about music that no one else has thought to do. And what do you want to do?
So there's the heart of MJ and Mark's date. Sitting out in their little car, talking. The page moves from the outside to the inside, and it focuses us in. Indeed, it's hard for me to read this page without thinking that there are multiple points of entry into it. We can start in the front, way outside of Mark's little car. But when we look at the page, maybe our eyes gravitate to MJ's eyes at the bottom there, or to Mark's eyes in the very last panel. There are multiple entry points into this page. So the goal of literary criticism is to describe how this page works, to analyze it and articulate it, and come to some sense of how this page achieves its charming little depiction of this moment of intimacy between these two high school students. So one way of starting that is to think about a literary term, scheme. It means form, and it simply means the arrangement of words. And we use scheme casually when we think of rhyme scheme. That's the arrangement of rhymes in a page. So comics have a scheme. They have a form. And that basic layout of a comic page, that basic scheme, is called the grid. The grid is, in a way, the iambic pentameter. It's the basic measure of how comics works. Now, the grid has evolved historically, and the oldest and most traditional forms of the grid are a 3x3 or even a 4x4 sequence of panels. So I've put a grid over this page, and I think you can see how it lays out. Some terms of the grid are rows or tiers or even strips. And we can see there are 3 rows, 1, 2, 3. And then there are columns. 3 columns. There could be 4, but here there are 3. 3 columns, 1, 2, 3. Those break down the page. Each box we call a panel. We could even think of it as an individual cartoon, like in a newspaper, an individual cartoon. And those panels line up in the rows, 1, 2, 3, into strips, like a cartoon strip in the newspaper. The thing with a comic book page is it compiles those panels into strips, and it stacks those strips into an overall page. But what's interesting is that each panel presents some action. Each strip adds those actions up into a small narrative that ends or has to resolve with some kind of tension. Those strips then add up and they create an overall tension that locks the page together. So in dividing a page into panels and strips and understanding how those strips work together, we're figuring out a way of talking about how comics page creates narrative tension. Now, there's a few other terms that are useful to comics pages. One is gutters. Those gutters are the white space that separate each panel and each strip. There's also the live area. The live area is the part of the page that the artist illustrates and the printer prints. There's also the bleed. The bleed is the part of the paper that the printer cuts off when he actually creates the comic as a page to be printed. So the bleed in this page is pretty neat. It's the white space that encapsulates all the action. But we could imagine that Mark Bagley could have drawn the drawings right across to the edge of the page and beyond, and that it could bleed out over the edge of the page. So, in presenting you with these terms, rows, tiers, columns, panels, strips, gutters, the live area, and the bleed, I intend to give you a very basic formal language for talking about how a comic book page moves. And my larger argument here is that every page tells a story. Every page tells an emotional setting. Now, some of those emotions can be crude. They can be just a fist fight. In this page, it's kind of basic. A romance, a car date, but it's actually fairly complicated, and it works beautifully. So my first thesis, the thesis for this lecture and the next, is every page is a poem. We can read every page individually. We can articulate every page's tensions and every page's conclusions to those tensions before we even turn to a full-length story. Each page has something to give us. So if each page is a poem, what we want to ask is, what is the poem about? What is the page about? So let's turn back to this page and ask, what's it about? It is about, on the most basic layer, a teenage romance. Indeed, I want to introduce a new term here. Its genre is romance. Genre is a Greek term, means family. We can think of genres related to genus, like gene pool, the genus of a species. But genre, we should be comfortable with that term when we choose a movie to watch on TV. However we choose our movies, whether we're sorting through a DVD collection or browsing in an online library. We're looking through genres: action, adventure, romance, mystery, sci-fi, horror. Those are all genres. And this, though it is in a comic book that's identified with the superhero genre, this is clearly a romance. So it's not just a romance. It's a particular moment in romance. The end of the date in the car. That's a moment that's, at least in American culture, tried and true. Many dates come to this moment of tentative conclusion, of possibility, and that moment I'm going to call a trope. A trope is another Greek term, and it means turn. It is a turn in the action. It's a figurative turn. Tropes are metaphors. They can be set scenes. And this set scene is that moment in a car. So I want to look at how the grid, how Bagley uses the grid to work this genre, the romance, and to really work this moment in the car. So let's look at it. He takes the grid. He faces a blank page. He has a script, but he takes the grid and he says, I'm going to start us way outside. Way outside. The date is concluding, and we're way outside the car. And he's going to divide that first basic tier into two long horizontal panels. But in that division, he's creating pacing, because the first long panel has no gutters. It's just an image. And to study it from end to end, we need to slow it down and look at it. So we take it in. It's as if we're across the street looking over. Wow, car stopped. Then we have a brief moment where we reorganize. And now we can see two faces.
And we're now pretty sure, oh, this is MJ and Mark in the car. And we're looking in. So just as they're having an awkward moment getting to know each other, we're getting to know them, but the pacing is still fairly slow. So he turns again, he moves us in again as we enter the second actual tier in the grid, but in fact the third tier of Bagley's performance here. We are now in the car, looking over MJ's shoulder at Mark. They have a conversation, and we move back and forth. This center tier is the most precise 3-panel strip. And in it, Mark begins to talk. Indeed, he presents his main idea, right, about graphic novels. He presents a little history there of graphic novels, and he's starting to talk. It goes from this awkward so to Mark's really in charge of the conversation. That's the action of that next strip, and we're going back and forth between the two. So, Bagley then takes us to the final tier, and he does something different here too. He divides that 3-panel grid into 4 panels. And this has the effect of making each panel a little tighter and giving us more beats in the strip. So the tension is building. There are more beats. Boom, 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 boom. And in fact, he creates an interesting contrast there between Mark's kind of bluish gray colors and MJ's bright red hair and lips. And he gives Mark a lot of talking, but he gives MJ a lot of power in that one narrow panel. So the heartbeat of the date increases as we read this comic. It starts from way outside, and then it brings us closer and closer and closer until in the end, we're basically in that car with them, and we're up close and tight. We're seeing their eyes, and we're aware of their lips, because that's where the date goes. So in that, we can say this page is about dates, it's about teenage romance, but more than that, as they begin to talk, it's about Mark's theory. It's about Mark's theory of being. He wants to be that. He wants to make a statement. And just as teenage romance is part of what it is to grow up, that sense of wanting to be an original is also part of what it means to grow up. It's also part of that intensity of self-discovery. In Mark's argument, it's about the history of comics. And he presents Will Eisner as this major creator, as someone who in his words, invented the comic book, the graphic novel. Now, this is pretty interesting because Mark's pretty well, he's got a theory for comic books. And so it goes. But what's interesting here is that this entire story is a relaunch. The entire Ultimate Spider-Man series is a relaunch of The Amazing Spider-Man from the 60s. And Mark Raxton, though he wants to be an original self, his very identity comes from the history of comics. In 1965, Stan Lee and Steve Ditko were writing The Amazing Spider-Man, and they wrote in issue 24 an issue about the Molten Man, in which the scientist, Mark Raxton, is turned into this golden armored monster, and Spider-Man has to fight him. So Mark Raxton is not only talking about the history of comics, but he is in fact prefigured by the history of comics. Indeed, his punk rock band, its very song title and name, is prefigured by comics itself. So Mark is trapped in a moment here. He's trapped in a moment where the very example for his originality, comic books, in fact defines him as unoriginal. The page is trapped in a similar moment. Their very moment of romance is defined by a generic form of the high school date and by the trope of being in the car. But more than that, because when we look back at that Amazing Spider-Man cover, we see in the top left-hand corner that Marvel itself is wrestling with what the comic book is. Stan Lee titles this not Marvel comic books, not Marvel superhero stories, but Marvel pop art. He too is wrestling with the limits of form, with trying to make comic books into something bigger than comic books, into art, just like Mark. So what is this page about? What is this page about? This poem is the story of the seduction of the origins as self-definition. It's about trying to be an original self, though so much in life defines us as not original. And that seduction is Mark's seduction of MJ in the car. But it's more than that. I would suggest in that center panel, it's also the seduction of the reader. Who are they looking at in that center panel? Mark's not even looking. His eyes aren't even focused on MJ Watson. And who is she looking at? Who is her expression looking at? Who is her eye turned to? Their eyes are turned to us. Their eyes are turned to the reader. And I would suggest that just as there are two entry points into this page, the opening car and then the bottom, Mark's face, just as your eye alights on those moments as a way into the page, your eye also alights to the center image. That center image in which Mark and MJ are looking at you. And they're wondering if they can seduce you into their romance of teenage dating and their romance of comic books. Now let me be clear. I don't know if Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Bagley talked about this page and said, okay, and we're going to make it a seduction in which we seduce the reader. I don't know if they said that. Maybe they just said, maybe Brian Michael Bendis just said to Mark Bagley, make it seductive. Maybe they didn't say anything. Maybe they didn't talk on the phone. Their intention is not quite as important as what this page actually does when you break it down and focus on the details. Because what this page does is it not only tells us a story, but it gets inside of us if we spend a little time with it. It, dare I say, attempts a seduction by infecting us with its own romance. So I come to my thesis for the week overall. Comics are a virulent art. They're an art form that wants to get inside us, that wants to get in our own bloodstream and get our imagination thinking and working. They're because of their mixture of textuality and visuality, they hit us in multiple senses and they want to get inside us. They want to be with us. Comics are a virulent art. Each page is a poem, but those pages add up together to tell powerful stories. So, when you read, think about how that grid works. Think about how the story breaks down and works through its tensions, but think about how the story, above all, talks to you.